Well, hello everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us here for the Beyond the Checklist Tools, Tips, and Tactics for Success Preparing for CMMC. Very excited to talk through some CMMC content with you all today. I guess I'll quickly introduce myself, and then I'll throw it over to our guest here today. Um, Next slide. Beautiful. Okay, there's our faces. So I'm Matt Bruggeman. I'm a federal lead here at A-LIGN. Really, I oversee all of our federal services. So I'll talk about this more, but A-LIGN does all sorts of cybersecurity assessment services. So anything federal really is primarily FedRAMP, CMMC, any of the NIST-based frameworks. I help oversee all of those. So Greg, honored to be joined by Greg today. Do you mind giving us a quick introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Matt, and welcome everyone today. My name is Greg LaRoche. I am the head of products at a company called PreVeil, and we are very involved in the compliance ecosystem, especially in the defense industrial base, and a lot more to come on that. My own background has a lot to do with enterprise software, specifically for information security and compliance. Great.
Beautiful. Thank you. We're very, very glad to have you guys. Very excited to talk through some stuff. So speaking of which, what are we going to talk through today? Here is the agenda. So, I think people come to these webinars in all sorts of various stages of the journey. So we don't want to leave anybody out. So we are going to cover some of the basics, just in case some people coming to this are relatively fresh and want maybe an overview on some things around like, what is CMFC? What are the levels? What are the requirements? As well as some very common topics that are, hey, what are the timelines, right? There's all these rulemaking processes that are always going on. What are the timelines with those? What's the current status? So we're going to walk through that as well. Then we're going to move a little bit deeper into, okay, now, spoiler alert on the first section, now that CMMC has been finalized for, about eight or 9 months, what are we seeing? What are we seeing out there right now? What are some common missteps for organizations that are preparing, that are undergoing the assessment? And what can we speak to from experience on both ends from Greg and PreVeil and myself from A-LIGN? Then we're going to talk a little bit more around, okay, now that we know maybe some of the common missteps that we're seeing out there, how can you better prepare for your assessment? Everybody listening, I'm sure, is interested in getting, for the most part, a level 2 certification. You're going to get assessed by a C3PAO for that. How do you properly prepare for that? And I know Greg will be especially insightful for a lot of the information on preparing properly. Then we'll talk through leveraging technology. What are some technology options that can help you out through this process? And then obviously, again, digging a little bit deeper into PreVeil, what that solution provides, and ultimately how it can help you. So on the next slide here, we talked a little bit about who we are. Oops, I think I went too ahead. Okay. We talked a little bit about who we are. Let's talk about our organizations. So kind of alluded to this, but I'll go first here. A-LIGN, we are a C3PAO. That's a CMMC third-party assessment organization. So there's all sorts of roles in the CMMC ecosystem. There's RPOs, MSPs, different external service providers. Then there's C3PAOs. So as I mentioned before, if you want a level 2 certification, you need to work with a C3PAO. That's really what CMMC is a validation method. Let's have a third party come in and assess you against NIST 171 Rev 2 and show that you're properly meeting those controls. So you need to work with a C3PAO in order to do that, in order to receive that level 2 certification. And that is primarily who we are in the CMMC space. Beyond that, we do all sorts of cybersecurity assessments. You name it, we do it. So like SOC 2, ISO 27000 series, high trust, HIPAA. As I mentioned before, we're a top 3 FedRAMP assessor, all sorts of FISMA flavor audits. You name it, we do it. So we try to be that one stop for anybody that needs those cybersecurity needs. So if you're listening to this webinar because you have CMMC interest, but then you go, oh, I actually did need help with SOC 2, that's something we can absolutely help with as well. So that's a little bit about the firm as it pertains to CMMC. And then beyond that as well, Greg, give us an overview on PreVeil. Who are you? What do you help with? All that sort of stuff.
Sure. Thanks again, Matt. So we are primarily a technology vendor, but we put in a couple extra things. So PreVeil provides an end-to-end encrypted file sharing and messaging technology platform. And that platform has been built for compliance under DFARS, CMMC, and ITAR requirements. So there is the technology piece, but we also offer, in addition to that, compliance tools, proven reference content, and wrap all that around an expert partner community to help our customers be successful.
It's beautiful. Yeah, as Greg mentioned, one thing I would highlight just from my experience with PreVeil is like there is the technology and what they help with, but they have a lot of really knowledgeable experts, and they built a lot of really helpful like documentation and things around that. So if you're interested in learning more, obviously chat with them. But um, while we're on this slide, Greg, maybe it'd be a good time to dive a little bit into setting the stage, as we mentioned, right? So let's go over some of the basics. We don't want to belabor the point too much, especially for those that are listening to this and know some of the basics. But again, we want to catch everybody up. So, um, Greg, feel free to chime in at any point. I don't want to necessarily just rip through all of this, but let's talk at the beginning. What is CMMC? So, as we've kind of alluded to thus far, so anybody in the defense industrial base, the DoD supply chain, a prime or subcontractor of the Department of Defense, is probably familiar with certain DFARS clauses, especially DFARS 7012. Basically, thou shall meet NIST 800-171, right? You need to be compliant to this control framework that is NIST 800-171. Well, fast forward years, then they've added, 7019, 7020 clauses, things that are basically saying, hey, we want some extra assurance that you're meeting this. Can you self-attest? Can you, or self-assess and then self-attest, basically, that you're meeting these requirements? And then over even more time, the DoD was basically finding, well, people aren't really meeting this in the way that we want them to. Our sensitive data is getting out into the hands of our adversaries, and we would really like more of a mechanism to ensure that our data is being protected by ensuring that our supply chain is meeting this NIST 800-171 framework. That's really the impetus for CMMC. Like I said, it's a validation mechanism. It's basically to say, hey, let's have third parties, C3PAOs like A-LIGN, come in, assess your organization for compliance to NIST 800-171 revision 2, and let's make sure you're meeting those controls, because again, we want to protect that sensitive data. So again, on that, who does it apply to? If you're in the prime, or if you're prime or subcontractor, really it's about that sensitive data. So we talk about federal contract information and controlled and classified information primarily. So we want to follow the data. Wherever that flows, those requirements are going to flow, right? There are flow down requirements for your prime and subcontractors, basically saying, hey, if you have CUI, for instance, controlled and classified information, and you are going to be sending that controlled and classified information to another vendor, you have a requirement to flow down this contract clause, which will be 7021 when that shows up in the contracts, which will be the CMMC clause. So a lot of organizations out there we know will be affected. The DoD estimated 80,000 for level 2 certification specifically in their numbers when they put out the rule. So I think some of the important things that, maybe I'll touch on just the levels really quickly, or Greg, if you want, maybe I can hand that piece over to you just so I'm not talking for 10 minutes straight. Greg, you mind giving the folks a little bit of an overview? I mentioned level 2 there. For those that aren't familiar, what's level 1? What's level 2? What's level 3?
Yeah, and that's an important thing to know as you're trying to decide what your journey is going to be for compliance. The level 1 requirements apply to something specifically called federal contract information, or FCI, which is not controlled unclassified information. So that's CUI. So there's the big difference, right? So if you're only protecting FCI, contract documentation, for example, that doesn't have any CUI in it, but in and of itself is federal contract information, that has to be required under a lighter set of standards, or 15 out of the 110 controls in the NIST 800-171 standard. And then if you do process, transmit, or store CUI in the performance of your contract, then you have to go to level 2. So that's the big difference.
Yep.
And level 2, of course, is the entire 110 control set under 800-171.
Exactly. So we often, if we or others are talking about CMMC, they'll often kind of just be assumingly talking about level 2, because that is the bucket where, again, you're needing to meet all 110 security requirements within NIST 800-171. And then beyond that, level 3, exceedingly rare. It's for specifically sensitive CUI that would be marked as such, and it would be a level 3 requirement. Basically, what you need to do is you need to get level 2 certified, And then the DoD actually, DIBCAT comes in and assesses you against the difference between the level 2 and level 3 requirements. So Greg, let's launch on this note of what is CMMC, where are we right now? Let's launch maybe a little bit into like what we're seeing right now and these rulemaking processes. This is a very common topic within CMMC. So to sort of set the stage a little bit, there are two accompanying rules that have kind of formed to finalize and roll out CMMC into requirements. The first one is often referred to as the 32 CFR rule because that's where it shows up in the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 170, if you're curious. That rule has been finalized. It has gone through the long, arduous, and very fun rulemaking process of the government, and that has been finalized. What does that mean? What is that rule? That is the CMMC program rule. So within it, it mentions everything around the program, right? What are the requirements? Who assesses? How do you assess? All these sorts of things. That is something anybody can go read now. And that was finalized at the very end, tail end of 2024. It became effective at the very tail end of 2024, really into the beginning of 2025. So all that is to say, if you're out there right now, you could get certified as early as like tomorrow, right? There are companies that have been going through this process and getting CMMC certified. We have been assessing basically since the beginning of 2025, right? So that's kind of the current state of the CMMC program. Now, the reason that maybe you haven't, because I get a lot of questions from clients that hear that and they go, okay, that's cool, but why hasn't it shown up in my contract then? That's the second rulemaking process. It has a little bit more of the enforcement behind it, what's often referred to as the 48 CFR rule. This rule, and we'll talk about where it's at in the stage, this one really has that enforcement from the DoD's perspective, right? It talks about in the phased rollout, like who does this apply to? Where does it show up in contracts? All those sorts of details. So once that rule gets finalized, that is when the phased rollout will begin, meaning the DoD will begin placing CMMC requirements, level 1, level 2, into their contract requirements. So that is really when I think we're going to start to see a huge pickup in organizations kind of opening their eyes to CMMC, taking this a little bit more seriously than they have in the past, potentially. And with 48 CFR, that one is in the very final stages of review. Without going too much into the details, because this could be its own separate webinar just on the timeline, we anticipate that to be finalized sometime here at the end of the year, likely October, November-ish of this year. So keep an eye out for that information. That'll be a huge marker to the industry on requirements coming from the DoD all the way down. The one thing I will throw out there, though, and Greg, I'll throw it over to you. I'm curious what you've seen as well. We've already seen a lot of clients coming to us and saying, I'm already being asked or required CMMC. So you go, okay, well, how is that with the 48 CFR thing you just mentioned? Basically, there's been the market rollout, which is to say everything with the 48 CFR that I just mentioned, that is about the DoD placing it into their contract requirements. There is nothing stopping prime contractors, and I'll tell you, there hasn't been anything stopping prime contractors going to their subcontractors and saying, hey, we need you to be taking this seriously. We need you to make sure you're, updating us on where you're at in the process. We need you to be certified by X date, all that sort of stuff. Greg, could you tell us a little bit more about like what have you guys seen like to date in the market in terms of clients coming to you and saying it's being required or asked of them, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, there's a lot of examples that fall into the category you mentioned briefly around the prime contractors, because they're trying to get their hands on supplier risk, right? And you think about some of these large airframers or aerospace companies or large manufacturers, they have very huge supply chains. So it's a very big task for them to manage the risk of supply chain and the compliance of their suppliers. So they're trying to get ahead of the game, putting a lot of pressure on their suppliers to, commit in writing to a CMMC journey and goal and objective. Some of them are wording their warning more strongly than others, but we're definitely seeing a lot of pressure coming from the primes down onto their suppliers saying, you folks, we want to see commitment from the supplier. We want to see dates. We want to see scores, because of course the requirements of 800-171 have been around for a long time. The suppliers should have been keeping track of their scores all along, so that they're basically making that more mandatory. We've also seen in a couple of agency environments outside the DoD even they're jumping the gun and getting ahead of some requirements. So even in requests for information prior to official request for proposal, they're including CMMC certification as a award criteria even before RFPs are going out. So we're seeing a couple of those too. So yeah, there's a lot of attention being driven in the market, and we're definitely seeing an increase in pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. If anybody's on this webinar and you hadn't heard it from any of your vendors or anything yet, like, it's certainly coming, not too long. And I think on Greg's point, one of the more telling ones, I think that, was out there in the ecosystem a lot. So people listening may have seen people like myself or others post about this, but Lockheed, if anybody's in the supply chain of Lockheed Martin, and you haven't seen this memo, we, comment in here, we can send it to you. They basically, to Greg's point, they basically were pretty strongly spelling out, hey, DFAR 7012 has been around for a while. You should be compliant to this, right? We're not telling you to get compliant. You should be. What we're telling you here in this memo is we're giving you a heads up that the CMMC thing, the CMMC program, it's here. The enforcement is right around the corner, and we need to make sure you're ready, right? So you keep us updated on where you're at, because we need to make sure you're ready. And this is us giving our sort of official warning that it is coming, not from us because we just want to, but like it's coming from the DoD. And then when it comes for us, we have requirements to require it of you all. So there have been a lot of signs of organizations and especially primes sort of putting this out there. So all that is to say, I would say CMMC is very much here. Obviously, it has been. There are almost 300 organizations that have been certified to date. That's actually from the Cyber AB, and we're going to have updated numbers on that in the next week in their latest town hall. They've been giving regular updates on the number of organizations that are assessed. So that number continues to grow. It's not like this is not happening. So with that in mind, we do have some data points. We have some experience, right? So Greg, I would love to throw it back over to you. We're about 8 months into the process here. From y'all's end, what are you guys seeing so far as common missteps that are emerging with clients and any customers that you guys are working with that are trying to go through the CMMC compliance and certification journey?
Yeah, that's a great topic. So first, let me start with some good news, right? So 35 companies of various types and sizes in the defense industrial base that are already using our product, PreVeil, to protect CUI and ITAR have achieved perfect 110 scores. So out of that 300 or so that were mentioned, 35 of those are using PreVeil. And so we have direct experience with those assessment outcomes and have some anecdotal information about that experience for those companies. So many more in the pipeline, more every week are coming through. So this audience should really see that this is an achievable goal if you have the right approach, which we're hopefully talking about today to give you some valuable information along those lines. But to talk about where people do get stuck or have problems, generally it's in a couple of places. One is in planning, which, this is, business 101, right? It's work your plan, have a plan. So what is planning when it comes to compliance? It really has a lot to do with understanding your environment, your scope, and your compliance boundary. That's a little bit of jargon, but basically it's about understanding where is the CUI in your business, where does it flow, what does it touch, who does it touch, and how does it get into your organization? How does it leave your organization? Does it have to be shared collaboratively? Does it not? So understanding all of that and doing your scoping up front is the number one place where people get stuck. If you just jump ahead into controls, you're going to waste your time. You really have to set scope, understand the boundary, set that in writing, and then implement the controls within that boundary and in and out of that boundary. So that's really like the first thing I would say in terms of getting caught off guard. Because you may or may not understand all the controls, but you need to understand who they apply to and mostly how the CUI flows in your business. So then the other area where we see some common people getting stuck is in the preparation and follow through. So compliance as a discipline, I'll remind everyone, it's really all about technology and process and people. So it's not just a technology problem. There's a lot of processes that have to be documented and maintained on an ongoing basis. compliance is forever. So it's not something you just do once, get your assessment, and then forget about it, right? That assessment is going to include a lot of commitments that the company is making to maintain those controls always and forever. and and so that requires periodic actions and documentation and evidence, things that have to get collected all the time throughout the year. And so that's where people get stuck. So oftentimes, folks are treating this kind of like a one-time task, and they're not really looking ahead to having the documentation they need, the documentation and processes in place that correspond or match their system security plan that is built to describe their boundary and how they implement all their controls. So it's basically a cascade. So you have to understand your program, then you have to document your program, then you have to implement and operationalize it so that you can prove to an assessor that you're actually doing what all that documentation says you are doing. And that's where people get stuck. If the documents don't match the actions, then that will be a problem for the assessor that they will point out. And so, those are the two big areas I would say where we see most people having to apply more energy, or in having to sometimes maybe even engage additional resources.
Yeah, that is great. I would echo a lot of those points from our perspective. I first want to applaud you, though, on a fun little saying. I think I'm going to get it tattooed on me. Compliance is forever. I'm going to write that down. That's a good one. Just right across my back. To further hammer a few points, I mean, the first thing I think of, so people, process, technology, I'm glad you called that out. I think a lot of people, just throw it back to you with something really quickly, Greg. A lot of people, understandably, maybe have heard of PreVeil, and they understand like, oh, that's a tool that can help me with the technology piece. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that's why you guys have built out a lot of these additional tools and skill sets. Could you speak to a little bit more around like, I know we'll probably talk about this later, but while we're on the topic, I think there's a misunderstanding, right? That, oh, PreVeil, yeah, they can help me with some aspects of the technology piece, but you guys do more than that. Could you talk about how you help with like the people process, some of the documentation, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, and we'll probably get into a little more detail on the pieces later. But at a higher level, we discovered really quickly, in order to make customers successful in their compliance journey and project, they really need more than just technology. Technology is important because it's protecting the data, which is the primary mission of CMMC. So we don't underemphasize that. We think that's a very important part of the mission. But in order to achieve your certification, you have to do a lot more. And so we aligned a lot of documentation templates that are pre-filled with the PreVeil information. We provide a lot of an example company that's a DIB company that has a fictional company that has a complete document set that we offer our customers that you can use as reference material. And that whole document set has been audited by, or been assessed by, a C3PAO. So we do that, and the other area when we call that whole program the Compliance Accelerator, and that also comes with an optional governance, risk, and compliance tool if you need a software solution, a place to keep all the information and track all these activities under compliance. We offer that as well. And also, lastly, we have built a large community of partners like A-LIGN and others that help in other areas that may be needed for a customer seeking their certification. So they may need help with technology, they may need help with process and documentation, they may need help with training, they might need to get an assessor in early to give them a pre-assessment or a gap assessment. There's a lot of examples of where a third-party partner can be really valuable. So that's really the three-legged stool of our offering, is the technology, the accelerator, and the partner community.
I love it. I'll just take this opportunity while we're on this slide just to say, from the C3PO's perspective, what have we seen in common missteps, and really just echo a lot of what you said. Honestly, I think to your point, sometimes it's a little bit surprising for us because we're on the tail end of your journey, right? Like, you might work with a PreVeil and or an MSP, maybe an RPO, whatever it might be. You've been going through certain steps. Maybe you've been working with others and getting, advice or thoughts from some folks. Sometimes it's surprising for us even how much we're seeing organizations have these sorts of things, exactly like you said, Greg, like starting from what seems like the very beginning, the very basics for us. And that is, don't just, I love that you phrase it like this, Don't just go, oh, let's just implement these 110 controls. Like, take a step back. Let's think about this, right? Let's think about the scope. Scoping is very important. Let's think about like data flow. Where is this data flow happening? Another common question I get from organizations that I'm talking to, they might say, hey, well, we don't currently get CUI. We don't currently have this contract, but we plan to, we want to. So what do I do? Right? Okay, well, map it out as if you were receiving that now, right? Like, think through and map out this data flow, because that's really going to help you determine your scope and what all assets need to be within scope, what type of assets, what locations. All these things are very critical. Then you can take a methodical approach. Then you can look at, talking to Greg and PreVeil and those sorts of solutions and go, okay, now I know what PreVeil would help with, right? Now I know what this would do. Now I know what that would do. Don't just kind of piecemeal this, because as a C3PAO, we haven't talked about this much. I don't know that we will. I might touch on it a little bit, but CMMC assessment process, it's broken into 4 main phases. The first phase is called a pre-assessment. Really, we do a high-level review of your system security plan, other documentation, and we have to, the words in the cap are, have like confidence in and review your completeness, accuracy, and consistency. Those are some of the adjectives that we need to look for in your documentation. So to Greg's point, a lot of times we can see inconsistencies there. That's an immediate red flag. Or we'll ask about certain external service providers that you might have in scope or that you might be sending CUI to. And we'll ask about, hey, if it's cloud service offering, is it FedRAMP or equivalent? No. Okay. Right there. It's like, we should not continue. That is right. That is a hard line. So there's these immediate things that you should understand at the very beginning that are going to be really critical. And then just to kind of harp on that documentation point again, Greg put this really well. As a C3PAO, we're needing to see what you do through the documentation, and then we're needing to validate that you're doing what you say you're doing, right? So if for us, some documentation isn't sort of matching up, there's something we're reading in the system security plan that doesn't nearly match a policy and procedure, that's a little bit of a red flag. That probably tells us, maybe you kind of wrote these to be compliant and that you might not be doing it. And then when we get into the assessment, maybe we find that that's the case. So I just wanted to echo everything that you had mentioned there, Greg. Say we're seeing very similar things on the C3PAO end. And then one thing I want to touch on here, we have a bullet here around timing. The thing I'll say, as far as a common misstep around timing, I would say is just misunderstanding the time that this could take for you. It's easy for us to all say, hey, DFAR 7012 has required you to be compliant to NIST 171 for years, so you should be. But let's be real, the entire reason CMMC is here, the truth is most organizations do not have a 110 out of 110, right? So it's going to take some time to do these things properly. It's going to take some time to understand and properly scope out, see what partners and tools might be helpful to you through the process, adequately prepare, document everything, and then getting on a C3PAO schedule. I think that's something that I'll probably talk about a little bit more later, but while I'm on the subject, C3PAO's backlogs are continuing to build. If this is something where you want to take this seriously, you want to get ahead of the game, and you want to make it a business differentiator between you and your competition and create a moat, I would recommend looking into getting certified as soon as possible, talking to C3PAOs, asking them what their backlog is, and potentially getting under contract with them before you're ready for the assessment. We do that with clients all the time. They're like, hey, I'm not ready today, but I'm in XYZ stage. Here's my sort of plan, and I'll be ready. We're planning whatever, mid-October, whatever it is. Can we get on your schedule a little bit after that, right? So make sure you're thinking through the entire project, all the timelines that are required in it, because as we talked about before, 48 CFR rule is going to really, really ramp up the requirements, especially from the DoD. It's going to begin the phase rollout with the DoD. It's going to ramp up your flow down requirements. And I think in general, I've seen this with other frameworks. I'm starting to see it with CMMC a little bit already as well. People are going to protect themselves, CYA. I won't spell that out, but everybody's going to generally, I think, over require this. That's even commercially. I've seen that with other requirements. I hear clients coming to me in the FedRAMP world all the time. They say, hey, I had this state come to me and say, hey, I need FedRAMP. I'm like, okay, well, that's not super applicable. I had this commercial organization say I needed FedRAMP. Okay, FedRAMP's if you're working with the federal government for the most part. There's some rabbit holes we could go down. So I think in general, you're going to start to see this. You're going to start to hear it way more than you are right now. So I think we're in an interesting sort of quiet before the storm right now, where if you are taking this seriously, you're getting your ducks in a row, you're getting a plan in place, and you're getting certified, you're going to come out the other end really good. So that when all this noise is happening, all these requirements are being thrown around, you're in a really good place and you're not scrambling at that point. Okay, so I want to move on to the next topic here. So we've kind of touched on this, kind of indirectly, talking about, the journey, common missteps, but let's talk specifically about preparing for the assessment. Greg, I'll throw it over to you. What are some best practices that you're seeing so far, I guess, in preparing for the assessment? I know that's kind of a broad topic, but then we can kind of go in any direction that you want from there.
Yeah, I'll make one comment on timing also. We kind of see it as a bell curve because people often ask like, how long does this take? If I'm not really in a really good place right now and I'm just beginning, how long does this take? And we see kind of a bell curve, and because we have thousands of customers, and they are generally getting through their compliance project timelines. The short tail of the curve is probably a couple of months, which is very rare. The mode or the majority of them are in the 6 to 12 month project scope range, and then there's a high end tail that goes maybe out to 24 months. And so the majority of these companies are looking at a 6 to 12 month project if they're starting from
Mhm.
scratch. So I just want to mention that because I get that question every day. So
Yeah, that's great.
but now let's switch over to prep. So getting ready for an assessment, we alluded to that earlier, as Matt said, when we talked about scoping and we talked about understanding, your environment and all that stuff. Really, one of the more important parts is picking the right team, because it's very unlikely that one person is going to do all this work all by themselves, right? So it's a daunting task. There's a lot of controls. There's a lot of objectives within each control that have to be documented and assessed. And so often you're going to need help, and that's where you really have to think about planning the total team for your compliance. Like, what is your scope? What is your boundary? Now, Matt mentioned a couple times managed service providers. We see this all the time in smaller companies that don't have an in-house IT organization. They're going to outsource that to a managed service provider. If they don't have in-house compliance expertise, they might outsource that to an advisor or RPO or CCP organization. And so, that's where you really want to think about it. So once you understand your scope and your project kind of timeline, you now want to say, okay, what resources are we going to need? What combination of skills and skill sets, the technology we've talked about, but now what else do we need besides technology? We need, what kind of MSP should we choose? What's appropriate for compliance? And so some of the criteria that are important, we think, and the reason, we have a partner program and keep track of the skill sets of our partners that we recommend is for these reasons. It's because they have the successful track record. They have familiarity with the technology that's in the boundary. They understand the documentation and the reference material. They have industry expertise in that particular vertical, for example, and they provide quality and service. So that those are the kind of partners we try to sign up in our partner program, and the kind we recommend. But again, if you go outside that ecosystem and choose different partners, just make sure that they meet some of that criteria, that they really understand the compliance realm, because there are a lot of managed service providers that frankly don't play in the compliance space, and they may have a harder time coming up to speed. So just consider that as you're making your plans. And then, lastly, Matt said earlier, where they often get involved towards the end, we highly recommend that you choose a C3PAO that understands what you're doing. They understand the technology you're using. They understand, the approach you're taking and the reference material you're using. They may identify that in the pre-assessment, but even before you even choose a C3PAO, you should think about, choosing one that is going to make your assessment smooth and cost effective.
Yeah.
Like
So
A-LIGN, for example, because they've taken PreVeil customers through assessment already, so they have that track record.
hey, Greg said it, not me. So I think you hit on a really important point here. everything that we talked about, like with like the common missteps of not properly planning from the beginning, not properly moving through those steps. I have, we have as an organization, unfortunately, seen a number of cases where that has been due to a misstep on exactly this point that Greg mentioned, not picking the right team to help them get ready. Whether that was, to your point, Greg, we've seen this in MSP, maybe that they've been working with for years. Like, oh, they're my MSP. They've helped me with other, IT needs. Like, they should be able to help me through CMMC. That's not necessarily the case, right? I would make sure properly vet every vendor, make sure they're very familiar with CMMC, the requirements, their role, right? One of the biggest issues that we see is like with an MSP, with a client having an MSP that's not as familiar with it. Maybe that MSP doesn't properly understand their role and their own requirements that they need to meet. And just so that anybody's listening is aware, if you're using an MSP, it is not a requirement for them to be certified, but they are a part of your assessment. They are a part of your compliance because they're handling and managing a lot of this for you. And so if your MSP isn't really up to speed on, those requirements, what is required of them, ultimately it's going to affect you. You're not going to be able to move through that assessment smoothly. And so picking these partners correctly at the beginning of the process, I just want to double stamp that, very important. And then the point that I brought up to talk about on here is a readiness assessment. So getting the right team, getting in a good place, obviously, is the place to start. There is the additional optional step for anybody that wants the added assurance of making sure they move through that assessment smoothly, of a readiness assessment, or as I will often refer to it as a mock audit, right? So really think of this as, all right, I'm fully ready. I've picked the right partners. I listened to Matt and Greg. They were fantastic, and I picked the right partners. I've gotten through this process. I am compliant to these controls. I'm ready to be assessed. Okay. If you want that extra added assurance of, hey, I've actually never been assessed by this before, right? I've never had a third party come in and look at the NIST 800-171A assessment methodology and look at all 320 assessment objectives. I don't really know what interview questions they're going to ask me. I don't know exactly what evidence they're going to ask, that sort of stuff. And you want to feel more confident going into that, just do a trial run of it, do a readiness assessment, do a mock audit, right? Basically, at least our approach at A-LIGN, what we'll do is we'll go through that process, right? We're basically going to say, hey, for all of NIST 800-171 and those 110 requirements, we have to check all 320 assessment objectives. So we're going to go through and assess you, right? As if we were going to be certifying you. Obviously, we're not involved in the DoD. We're not issuing a certification, all those sorts of things. But we're going to ask, personnel to be interviewed. And we're going to ask them interview questions. We're going to ask for evidence, artifacts, documentation, all these sorts of things. So it can give you guys a really good feel for exactly what I mentioned before. This is what I hear from clients that go through this. The most valuable piece is them getting a sense of, oh, now I understand. These are the type of questions they ask of who maybe we didn't fully know that, so we weren't properly prepared, just because, again, we haven't had a third party assess us against this yet. So if that's something you're interested in, again, completely optional step, not a requirement, but a lot of clients use that as an added step to add some assurance that that assessment's going to go smoothly. Because I would say some of the risks, while we're on this topic of moving through that assessment when you're not ready, are, number one, in phase one, we could catch a lot of those issues, that pre-assessment, and then it just drags on, right? We say, hey, there's an issue here. And then the organization seeking certification goes, oh, crap, that's a pretty big thing we missed. Okay, we're going to need a few months to go figure that out. And then it just constantly keeps getting delayed. And then eventually, obviously the worst case scenario is we move through phase one, your documentation looks like you're ready. But phase one is not us saying, are you going to pass or not? That's not the intent of phase one. Phase one is like, are you ready to be assessed? Do you have all your documentation in order? Are there any red flags that we're seeing that go, you're not ready for this? Once we move into phase two, that's more of the detailed assessment. That's when we're looking assessment objective by assessment objective. And that's when we look at your compliance, your actual compliance, and assess your conformity to NIST 800-171 Rev 2. So within that, you could fail that, right? There's also the conditional that could, open up a 180-day POAM. We won't go down that rabbit hole necessarily, but all that is to say, it's the highest added assurance that you can going into the assessment that you'll pass the first time, and you won't have delays through that assessment process. All right, Greg, I need to move on here. We don't have a ton of time left, but we have another topic that we want to talk about. So again, something we've sort of briefly touched on, but leveraging technology, obviously, as we've mentioned, PreVeil is a technology and can help with a lot of that. But let's talk about some of the benefits of certain tools when developing like your overall strategy, right? So people are listening to us, they say, okay, I want to make sure I'm picking the right partners. I'm thinking about this from the beginning. I'm thinking about my scope. What are some sort of benefits, and how would you advise clients on thinking through sort of the technology piece?
Yeah, and that's an important piece because that often is the place where this CUI data is protected, stored, transmitted, et cetera. So what we see in our customer base, the folks that choose to work with us and that see value in how we're approaching this problem, they're generally interested in streamlining the process and minimizing the boundary. So they often are pursuing a technology strategy that a lot of people refer to as an enclave, right? Where you're separating out the CUI from the other stuff. And the CUI is going to be processed, transferred, and accessed and stored in a separate environment that is part of the compliance boundary. And then you may have commercial business or other business units that lie outside the boundary, and they are not affected by the compliance project. So that's generally an approach we see a lot with our customers. And so the key there is to look at a technology that is not going to be disruptive to your existing infrastructure. So you can keep your commercial business running just the way it is, but yet you can still create a compliant CUI bubble to keep all your CUI in and be compliant in that part of your business. You also want to choose technologies that are easy to deploy and easy to use, because at the end of the day, people have to comply. So the people have to follow the rules and do the right thing. And therefore, you have to make that as easy as you can for them, using kind of familiar interfaces and familiar models for their work every day. So, we definitely offer solutions that meet those criteria. So often the customers that choose to work with us are looking for a CUI enclave that is not going to disrupt their existing environment. They like the fact that we have preloaded documentation. They like that we offer a governance, risk, and compliance tool to project manage all this stuff, and that we have an actual fictional company that's been assessed and have all their documentation in the system. So all that together really, is most of the time where we find customers are choosing to go with us as a optimal solution.
I'm glad you touched on the enclave portion. Again, there's so many topics within this broader CMMC topic that I'm sure we could do a whole webinar on, but I'm glad you mentioned that because we hadn't to date, right? When previously we had mentioned kind of starting from a scoping perspective, Greg's right. That's a really good place to start and think about. And a lot of times organizations think about it in that way, right? Do I want to go with something like an all-in approach, i.e., my entire organization, all the people, processes, technologies are going to be in scope. I need to be, making sure everybody is compliant. All these aspects are compliant to the controls. Or do you set up an enclave, right? Do you say, hey, that's just not super feasible, especially with all the different commercial business that I do, or whatever it might be. I only have a few people that actually do this work. Why would I bring, hundreds of employees into scope, or whatever it might be for your organization? It's a really good place to start to think about it. And that's why a lot of times people will look at something like PreVeil and look at, okay, this can really help me sort of manage and minimize my scope, right? Because again, Greg touched on the timelines. And again, I'm glad you touched on that, Greg. These timelines can take a while, especially if you're bringing like your whole organization in scope. And so I think a lot of times working with the PreVeils of the world, different advisors, you want to think through exactly that. What is our scope? How can we minimize our scope? But the other thing you want to think about is like make sure it's operational, right? Don't just minimize your scope to minimize your scope and be like, oh, it's one person because that's an easy scope. I can get certified under that. And then you're like, oh shoot, I can't actually perform under this contract and do the work I'm contracted for with this scope of just this one person and whatever else it might be. So thinking about the scoping is very critical early on. And yes, technology and these tools and these tech-enabled partners can really help with minimizing the scope and streamlining that overall process. And I think one of the last things I'll touch on, because I think we're coming up on time here, is I'll go to the last slide here as we sort of wrap up. I think one of the big advantages, Greg kind of mentioned of this, especially when you're thinking about choosing your partners, making sure that your partners are kind of understanding and aware of your approach and what you're doing, right? Whether that is, hey, are you aware of PreVeil and their solution and what they help me with? or any version of that throughout your process, making sure that not only are you vetting your partners, whether it's a C3PAO, an MSP, a Prevail solution, whatever it might be, um, not only vetting them individually, but starting to think through, especially on the C3PAO end, right? Ask these questions. Hey, this is what we're using, what we're planning on doing. Are you familiar with that? Make sure that they're comfortable with the approach, not in the sense that you want advice from them, but just in the sense that, again, you want to streamline this overall process as much as possible. And I think that's where partnerships like this make a ton of sense, where it's like A-LIGN is obviously very familiar with the Prevail solution, assessing clients that have used the Prevail solution successfully. And I think that that can only be helpful for you, right? From the OSC perspective, thinking about, how can I make this as frictionless as possible, right? The overall journey. Greg, as we sort of wrap up here, any last things that we didn't touch on that you want to touch on? Any parting words of wisdom for our group outside of all of our new tattoo that we're going to get together? Anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think just to kind of put a bow on everything we've talked about today, it's the ultimate objective is obtaining that 110 score, right? And that's what you want. And that's what you're putting all this time and effort into achieving. So, hopefully we've left you with the impression that it really planning and understanding and putting the right team together with the right track record of success and putting that all together with a knowledgeable and experienced assessor is the recipe for obtaining the 110 score. That's the way to get there. And we hope hope we get to work with a lot of you along the way.
Thank you so much, Greg. I didn't mention up top, but any questions that have been coming in, and if there's any last questions that you want to throw in the chat, we're going to answer those afterwards, right? So we will email out answers to any of the questions. Make sure you guys get all the answers to those questions. But I just want to say thank you all again so much for joining. If you're interested in learning more about any aspect of the CMMC journey, reach out to both Prevail and A-LIGN. And specifically, if you're interested in thinking through how, everything that we talked about here can kind of simplify your process through your CMMC certification journey, let us know. But outside of that, thank you all again so much for joining, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you again, Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, and thanks everybody.